The baby was already falling when Alaric Nyx caught it. One moment he had been walking up the marble steps of the city's oldest library, his pale fingers trailing along the iron railing as dusk settled into true darkness. The next, his ancient reflexes snapped into action before his conscious mind could process what was happening. A woman stumbled at the top of the stairs, her knees buckling, eyes rolling back, and the bundle in her arms slipped from her grasp with terrible inevitability. Alaric moved faster than any human eye could track. The world slowed to that stretched-out quality he had experienced countless times over his 5 centuries of existence. He was suddenly there, 10 steps higher than he had been, his arms extended just as the infant dropped into them with a soft weight that felt impossibly fragile against his preternatural strength. The child didn't even have time to cry out. It simply blinked up at him with wide brown eyes, utterly trusting, completely unaware of the danger it had just escaped. The woman collapsed onto the cold stone steps with a sound that made Alaric wince. He caught her with his other hand before her head could crack against the marble, his vampire speed allowing him to cradle both mother and child as if they weighed nothing at all. She was unconscious, her face pale beneath her warm brown skin, dark circles under her eyes speaking of exhaustion that went bone deep. Her pulse fluttered weakly against his fingertips, and he could smell the faint scent of her blood, sweet and human and utterly intoxicating in a way that made his jaw tighten with control. The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, and Alaric found himself looking down into those impossibly innocent eyes. The child couldn't have been more than 6 months old, with a dusting of dark hair and chubby fists that reached toward him curiously. Something unexpected twisted in Alaric's chest, something he hadn't felt in decades. Protectiveness, raw and fierce and utterly irrational. "What have we here?" he murmured, his voice carrying that faint accent of old Europe that never quite left, no matter how many modern languages he learned. Around them, other library patrons were beginning to notice the commotion, their footsteps hurrying closer, their voices rising in concern. "Someone call an ambulance. Is she breathing?" Oh my God, the baby. Alaric straightened to his full height, the woman cradled in one arm, the infant secure in the other, and the crowd instinctively stepped back. It was always this way. Humans could sense what he was on some primal level, even if they couldn't name it. Their hindbrain recognized predator when it saw one, no matter how civilized the packaging. He was striking even by vampire standards tall and lean with the kind of aristocratic features that seemed carved from marble. His hair fell to his shoulders in waves of pure white, though his face appeared no older than 30. His skin held that telltale pallor that no amount of makeup could fake, luminous and perfect and fundamentally wrong, in a way that made humans uncomfortable without understanding why. His eyes were the pale gray of morning mist, ancient and knowing, ringed with the faintest crimson that betrayed his true nature to those who knew what to look for. "I have her," Alaric said, his voice carrying a note of command that made the gathering crowd hesitate. "Someone fetch water. She's fainted, nothing more." That wasn't entirely true. He could hear her heartbeat, could sense the weakness in her blood, could smell the faint sweetness that suggested low blood sugar or perhaps simple starvation. This woman had been running herself ragged, and her body had finally given out. The baby seemed healthy enough, though, squirming in his arms with surprising strength. A young man rushed forward with a bottle of water from his backpack, his hands shaking as he handed it to Alaric. The vampire king of the Eastern Territories, though none of these humans knew that, lowered himself gracefully to sit on the steps, arranging the unconscious woman so her head rested against his knee while he kept the baby secured with his other arm. It was an oddly domestic tableau, him sitting there in his expensive black suit, with a stranger's child gurgling contentedly in his embrace. The woman stirred after a moment, her eyelids fluttering. Alaric dampened his fingers with the water and pressed them gently to her temples, to her wrists, helping to bring her back to consciousness. When her eyes finally opened, they were a warm hazel that caught the golden light from the library's windows, and they widened in confusion and then alarm. "My baby," she gasped, trying to sit up too quickly. "Safe," Alaric assured her, turning slightly so she could see the infant in his arms. "You fainted. I caught her before she fell." "Him," the woman corrected automatically, then seemed to realize what he'd said. Her face went through a rapid series of expressions: relief, horror, gratitude, embarrassment. Oh God, I'm so sorry. Did he fall? Is he hurt?" "Not even a scratch," Alaric said, and found himself offering what he hoped was a reassuring expression, though he was out of practice with such things. "I was fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right moment." The woman pushed herself up to sitting, and Alaric helped her with his free hand, noting how she trembled with weakness. Up close, he could see she was lovely despite her obvious exhaustion, with high cheekbones and full lips, and those remarkable eyes that seemed to carry both strength and vulnerability in equal measure. She couldn't have been more than 25, though the weariness made her seem older. "Thank you," she whispered, reaching for her son. Alaric transferred the baby carefully into her arms, watching as she clutched the child to her chest with the fierce desperation of a mother who had just faced her worst nightmare. "Thank you so much. I don't know what happened. 1 second I was fine, and then everything just went dark and I felt him slipping, and her voice broke and tears began streaming down her face." The baby, sensing his mother's distress, began to fuss and cry. The woman tried to soothe him, but her hands were shaking too badly, and her breathing was coming in short, panicked gasps. "You need to eat," Alaric said, his voice gentle but firm. "And drink something with sugar. When was the last time you had a proper meal?" The woman looked at him with those brimming eyes and shook her head. "I don't." "Yesterday? Maybe the day before. I've been so busy with work and the baby, and I just forgot." "You forgot to eat for 2 days?" Alaric kept his tone neutral, but inside he felt that strange protectiveness surge again. What kind of circumstances led a young mother to such a state? "That explains the fainting. I'm fine," she insisted, even as she swayed where she sat. "I just need to get home." "We'll be okay." She tried to stand, and Alaric caught her elbow as her knees buckled again. The crowd around them had grown larger, people murmuring with concern, several offering their phones to call for help. The baby's crying had escalated to full wails now, and the woman looked close to falling apart completely. "Let me help you," Alaric said, making a decision that he would later recognize as the moment everything changed. "There's a cafe just around the corner. Let me buy you dinner and make sure you're stable enough to get home safely." "I can't accept that," the woman protested, but her voice was weak. "You've already done so much. I don't even know you." "My name is Alaric Nyx," he said, offering his hand formally, "and I would feel considerably better knowing you ate something before attempting to care for your son. Consider it a selfish request. I'd prefer not to wonder all night whether you collapsed again the moment I left you." The woman stared at him for a long moment, clearly torn between pride and practicality. Finally, she took his hand, and Alaric felt the warmth of her skin against his cold palm like a shock. "Arya Nichols," she said softly, "and this is Mason. And Okay, thank you. You're very kind." Kind was not a word that had been applied to Alaric in centuries. Powerful, yes. Ruthless when necessary. A fair but exacting ruler of his territory. But kind? That implied a gentleness he had long since abandoned. Yet looking at this exhausted young mother with her crying baby, he found himself wanting to be exactly that. He helped Arya to her feet, keeping a steadying hand on her elbow as they descended the library steps. She clutched Mason tightly, bouncing him in that automatic way mothers did, murmuring soft reassurances even though she clearly had none for herself. Alaric shortened his naturally long stride to match her slower pace, hyper-aware of how fragile she was, how easily she could stumble again. The cafe he led her to was one he frequented in the early evenings, before the sun had fully set and after it had begun its descent. The owner knew him as a wealthy eccentric who only ever ordered black coffee, and occasionally a pastry he never actually ate. She greeted him with a knowing smile that faltered slightly when she saw Arya and the baby, but recovered quickly enough. "Table for 2?" she asked, reaching for menus. "Something quiet in the back, please, Helena," Alaric said, "and bring the lady whatever she wants immediately. She hasn't eaten in quite some time." Helena's expression shifted to concern, and she ushered them to a corner booth with comfortable cushioned seats. Alaric slid in across from Arya, who was still trying to calm Mason. The baby's cries had subsided to hiccuping sobs, and he kept grabbing at his mother's shirt with those tiny fists. "He's hungry too," Arya said, her cheeks coloring. "I need to. Is there somewhere private I could?" "The bathroom is just there," Helena interjected kindly, pointing toward the back. "It's single occupancy and quite spacious. Take your time, dear." Arya stood, swaying only slightly, and Alaric resisted the urge to follow her just to make sure she didn't faint again. Instead, he waited until she disappeared into the bathroom, then turned to Helena with an intensity that made the older woman blink. "Bring your most substantial meal," he said quietly. "Protein, carbohydrates, something with iron if you have it, and orange juice, water, and hot tea. Put it on my account and add a generous tip for yourself." Helena studied him with shrewd eyes. "She's not your usual type. I have a type?" Alaric raised one pale eyebrow. "You know what I mean. She's got a baby, Alaric. She's vulnerable." "Which is precisely why I'm helping her," he said evenly. Nothing more complicated than that. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. There was something about Arya Nichols that had caught his attention in a way nothing had in years. Perhaps it was the way she had fought to stay conscious even as she fell. Perhaps it was the fierce love he'd seen in her eyes when she reached for her son. Perhaps it was simply that she had looked at him without the usual fear or calculated interest he saw in most faces. Arya emerged from the bathroom 15 minutes later looking slightly more composed, with Mason settled in her arms, his eyes drooping with milk-drunk satisfaction. She slid back into the booth just as Helena arrived with enough food to feed 3 people a burger and fries, a bowl of soup, a side salad, bread, and all the drinks Alaric had requested. "I can't eat all this," Arya protested. But her stomach betrayed her with an audible growl. "Eat what you can," Alaric said. "The rest can be wrapped up for later." He watched as she dove into the food with an urgency that confirmed just how desperately hungry she'd been. She tried to maintain some semblance of manners, but after the first few bites she simply ate, her body taking over from her pride. Mason dozed in her lap, one hand fisted in her shirt, and Alaric found himself studying them both with an intensity that should have alarmed him. "This is really embarrassing," Arya said between bites, not quite meeting his eyes. "I swear I'm not usually such a disaster. It's just been a really hard few weeks. You don't need to explain anything to me," Alaric said, then paused. "But if you want to talk, I'm a good listener." Arya glanced up at him then, really looked at him for the first time, and he saw her take in his unusual appearance. Her gaze lingered on his white hair, his pale skin, the aristocratic angles of his face. But instead of the fear or suspicion he often encountered, he saw only curiosity. "Are you albino?" she asked, then immediately flushed. "I'm sorry, that was rude. It's none of my business." "It's a fair question," Alaric said smoothly, having perfected this particular lie over many years. "I have a rare genetic condition. The sunlight bothers me, hence the pale complexion and hair." "It's striking," Arya said, and there was no artifice in her voice. "You look like you stepped out of a painting or something." Very dramatic. Alaric felt something he hadn't experienced in over a century. He felt pleased by a compliment. He covered it by sipping his black coffee, letting the bitter liquid sit on his tongue without swallowing. He couldn't actually digest food anymore, but coffee at least tasted like something. "You were going to tell me about your hard weeks," he prompted gently. Arya sighed, using a French fry to push her food around her plate. "Lost my job about 3 weeks ago. The company downsized, and I was one of the last hired, so first fired. I've been burning through my savings trying to find something new, but daycares are expensive, and nobody wants to hire someone who has to leave early for baby emergencies." "Mason's father." She paused, her jaw tightening. "He's not in the picture. Never was, really. So it's just us." The protectiveness Alaric had felt earlier intensified into something almost painful. This woman was facing challenges that seemed insurmountable, yet she kept going. She kept fighting. There was a strength in her that called to something deep in his ancient soul. "What kind of work do you do?" he asked. "Did," Arya corrected with a bitter smile. "I was an administrative assistant at a law firm. Glorified secretary, really, but it paid the bills. Now I'm applying to anything that'll have me. Retail, food service, whatever I can manage with Mason. My mom helps when she can, but she works full-time too, and she's an hour away." Alaric made a decision in that moment, one that would complicate his carefully ordered existence in ways he couldn't yet foresee. "I may have a solution to your problem." Arya looked at him skeptically. "You just met me. You don't know anything about my problems. I know you're hardworking, responsible, and clearly devoted to your son," Alaric said. "And I know that I'm in need of someone to help manage my affairs. I have extensive business interests that require organization and attention to detail. The position would be based from my home, with flexible hours that would accommodate your childcare needs. Mason would be welcome in the workspace." He watched the emotions play across Arya's face: hope, suspicion, desperate want, and cautious distrust, all battling for dominance. She set down her fork and leaned back, studying him with those remarkable hazel eyes. "Why would you offer that to a complete stranger?" she asked quietly. "Nobody does that. What would you want in return?" "Content work," Alaric said simply. "I'm offering you a job, Miss Nichols, not a complicated arrangement. You need employment that accommodates your circumstances. I need assistance. It's logical. How much would it pay?" He named a figure that made her eyes widen, a salary that was considerably more than generous for administrative work. But Alaric was wealthy beyond measure. What were human dollars to someone who had accumulated 5 centuries of wealth? And the amount meant nothing to him while clearly meaning everything to her. "That's too much," Arya said. "For just administrative work, that's way too much." "Then consider it fair compensation for the odd hours I keep," Alaric said. "I do most of my work at night. I would need someone who could be available in the evenings and accommodate my somewhat unusual schedule. That, at least, was true. He couldn't exactly explain that he was a vampire and conducted most of his business after sunset, but the explanation served well enough. Arya chewed her bottom lip, thinking. Mason stirred in her lap, making small sleeping sounds, and she absently adjusted him to a more comfortable position. Finally, she looked at Alaric with an expression that was both resigned and determined. "I'd want a trial period," she said. 2 weeks, maybe, to make sure it's a good fit for both of us. And I'd want the arrangement in writing, with proper contracts. I'm not trying to be difficult, but I have to think about Mason first." "Perfectly reasonable," Alaric agreed. "My attorney can draw up a contract tomorrow. When can you start?" "Tomorrow," Arya blinked. "That's fast. You need money. I need help." "Why delay?" Alaric tilted his head, watching her. "Unless you have other opportunities you're considering?" "No," she admitted. "No, I don't. This seems too good to be true." "Things like this don't happen to people like me. Perhaps they should happen more often," Alaric said quietly. "Not everything requires suspicious motives, Ms. Nichols. Sometimes help is simply help." Except that wasn't entirely true, and he knew it. There was something about Arya that fascinated him, that drew him in ways he couldn't fully explain. It wasn't merely her blood, though that sang to him with a sweetness that made his control waver. It wasn't just her beauty. Though she was lovely in that understated way, he found far more appealing than obvious glamour. It was something ineffable, something about the combination of her strength and vulnerability, her fierce maternal love and quiet determination. He wanted to help her. More than that, he wanted to keep her close, and that was dangerous territory for a vampire king who had long ago learned that attachments were weaknesses, that caring for mortals only led to inevitable heartbreak as they aged and died while he remained unchanged. But for the first time in decades, Alaric found himself willing to take that risk. They finished the meal with Arya eating until she could barely move, and Alaric nursing his coffee, while they discussed the logistics of her new position. She would come to his estate tomorrow evening. He gave her an address in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city, which made her eyebrows rise, and they would begin with simple organizational tasks. She could bring Mason. There would be a space set up for him, and they would proceed from there. When it was time to leave, Alaric insisted on calling a car service to take Arya home. She protested, but he could see the exhaustion settling back into her bones, and there was no way he was letting her attempt public transportation with a baby while still recovering from fainting. "You've done too much already," Arya said as they waited outside the cafe for the car. The night had fully settled now, and Alaric felt the familiar surge of energy that came with darkness. This was his element, his time. The shadows seemed to bend toward him in welcome. "I've done what any decent person would do," Alaric replied. "And tomorrow I'm simply gaining an employee. No debt required." The car arrived, a sleek black sedan that Helena had ordered at his request, and Alaric opened the door for Arya, waiting while she settled Mason in her lap. Before she could close the door, he caught it, holding it open for a moment longer. "Thank you," Arya said, looking up at him with those eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "I don't know what I did to deserve this kind of luck, but thank you." "Perhaps you simply deserved a turn of good fortune," Alaric said. "Sleep well, Miss Nichols. I'll see you tomorrow evening." He closed the door and stepped back, watching as the car pulled away into the night. Only when it had disappeared around the corner did he allow himself to acknowledge the strangeness of what had just occurred. In all his centuries, he had never involved himself so deeply in a human's life. He had kept mortals at arm's length, had maintained the careful distance necessary for his kind. He had lovers when it suited him, employees when he needed them, but always with clear boundaries, always with the understanding that they were temporary diversions in his eternal existence. But Arya Nichols had fallen on those library steps, and Alaric had caught her baby, and something had shifted in that moment, something fundamental and irreversible. "You're playing a dangerous game," he murmured to himself, then turned and melted into the shadows, moving with preternatural speed toward the estate where his real life awaited the one filled with vampire politics, territorial disputes, and the weight of ruling a kingdom of immortals who both respected and feared him. He would need to be careful. Arya couldn't know what he truly was. The Vampire Council had strict rules about revealing their existence to humans, and those rules existed for good reasons. Humans panicked. They told others. They tried to hunt what they feared. It was safer for everyone if the mortal world remained ignorant of the creatures that walked among them. But as Alaric entered his mansion through the shadows, bypassing locked doors and security systems with ease, he found himself wondering how long he could maintain the deception. And more troublingly, he found himself wondering if he even wanted to. The next evening, Alaric spent an unusual amount of time preparing for Arya's arrival. He had his housekeeper, a vampire named Isolde, who had served his household for 2 centuries, set up a comfortable workspace in one of the estate's smaller parlors, one with plenty of natural light from tall windows and a pleasant view of the gardens. He had her add a play area with soft mats and age-appropriate toys for Mason, drawing on vague memories of what human infants might need. He even had fresh flowers brought in, then worried that was too much and had them removed, then changed his mind again and had them brought back. "You're nervous," Isolde observed, watching him rearrange furniture with his preternatural strength. "I've never seen you nervous. What's special about this human?" "Nothing," Alaric said too quickly. "She's simply an employee who needs accommodation for her child. I'm being considerate." Isolde, who looked like a severe woman in her 40s but was actually closer to 300 years old, gave him a look that suggested she didn't believe a word of that. "Of course. How considerate. Is that why you've changed your shirt 3 times? Alaric glared at her, but she merely smiled and went to answer the door at the sound of the bell. He heard Arya's voice, nervous and trying to hide it, and Isolde's warmer response. Then footsteps, and Arya appeared in the doorway of the parlor with Mason on her hip and a diaper bag slung over her shoulder. She looked better than she had yesterday. Her face had more color, her eyes were brighter, and she dressed in simple but professional clothes that suggested she was taking this job seriously. Mason was awake and alert, his big brown eyes taking in the new surroundings with infant curiosity. "This is amazing," Arya breathed, looking around the parlor with obvious appreciation. "Your home is beautiful." "Thank you," Alaric said suddenly, seeing the space through her eyes, the antique furniture, the artwork that spanned centuries, the general air of wealth and taste that he'd accumulated over his long life. To her, it must seem impossibly grand. "Please, make yourself comfortable. The desk there is yours, and the area by the window is for Mason." Arya set down her bag and carried Mason over to the play area, her expression softening as she took in the toys and soft surfaces. "You did this for him?" It seemed practical. Alaric said, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her voice. "I assumed he would need entertainment while you worked. This is more than entertainment. This is really thoughtful." She set Mason down, and he immediately grabbed for a soft stuffed animal, bringing it to his mouth. "Thank you." They settled into an easy routine surprisingly quickly. Alaric provided Arya with stacks of correspondence that needed organizing, financial records that required filing, and various administrative tasks that he actually did need help with. Running a vampire territory required significant paperwork, even if Arya didn't know that's what she was helping with. She worked efficiently, asking intelligent questions when she needed clarification, and seemed genuinely interested in doing the work well. Mason proved to be an easy baby, content to play with his toys or nap in the portable crib Isolde brought in. Occasionally he would fuss, and Arya would take a break to tend to him, but she always returned to her work with renewed focus. Alaric found himself watching them more than he should, fascinated by the easy intimacy between mother and child, the way Arya's whole face softened when she looked at her son. "He's beautiful," Alaric said during one such moment, the words escaping before he could think better of them. Arya looked up, surprised, then smiled. "I think so too, but I'm biased. He has his father's eyes." She paused, her expression darkening slightly. "That's about all he got from him, thankfully. You said he's not involved?" Alaric kept his tone carefully neutral, though he was intensely curious. "He made it very clear he wanted nothing to do with being a father," Arya said, her voice flat. "The minute I told him I was pregnant, he was gone. Haven't heard from him since. It's fine, though. We're better off without someone who didn't want us." The matter-of-fact way she said it made Alaric's chest tighten. She deserved better than that. They both did. "His loss," he said quietly. Arya's eyes snapped to his, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding, of recognition. Then she looked away, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Yeah, his loss." They worked together for several hours, the evening slipping into night, which was Alaric's preferred time anyway. He found excuses to stay in the parlor with her, rather than retreating to his own study, telling himself it was simply to be available if she had questions. But really, he just wanted to be near her, wanted to hear her quiet humming as she worked, wanted to watch the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she concentrated, wanted to see her interact with her son with such unconscious grace. It was dangerous, this fascination, but Alaric found he didn't care. Over the following days, Arya became a fixture in his home, arriving each evening and staying late into the night. She never questioned his odd hours, accepting his explanation about insomnia and night owl tendencies with easy grace. Mason grew comfortable in the space, starting to smile and babble when he saw Alaric, reaching for him with those tiny hands. The first time Alaric held the baby again was nearly a week after that first evening. Arya had needed both hands to sort through a particularly complex filing system, and Mason was fussing to be held. Without thinking, Alaric had simply reached for the child, settling him against his chest with surprising ease. Mason immediately calmed, apparently content with his unusual babysitter. "He likes you," Arya said, her voice soft with something that might have been wonder. "He doesn't usually take to people so quickly. Perhaps he remembers that I caught him," Alaric suggested, bouncing the baby gently. Mason grabbed at his shirt with those strong little fists, gurgling happily. "Maybe." Arya watched them for a long moment, and Alaric felt the weight of her gaze. "You're different than I expected." "How so?" "I don't know. You're this wealthy, powerful guy living in a mansion, but you're holding my baby like it's the most natural thing in the world. It's just unexpected." Alaric looked down at Mason, at those trusting brown eyes and that toothless smile, and felt something crack in the careful walls he'd built around his heart over centuries. He's easy to hold. After that, it became a regular occurrence. Alaric would hold Mason while Arya worked, or play with him on the floor, while Arya took a break to eat the dinner, Isolde always prepared for her. The housekeeper watched these developments with knowing eyes but said nothing, though Alaric occasionally caught her smiling when she thought he wasn't looking. A month passed, then 2. The trial period Arya had requested came and went without discussion, both of them simply continuing as if there had never been any question of her staying. She proved invaluable. Organizing systems Alaric hadn't even realized were chaotic, streamlining his correspondence and generally making his administrative life significantly easier. But more than that, she made his home feel different. Warmer, more alive. He found himself looking forward to the evenings in a way he hadn't in decades, counting down the hours until sunset when he could wake fully and know that she would arrive soon. He began to crave her presence the way he once craved blood, a need that went beyond physical into something deeper and more concerning. He was falling for her. The realization hit him one evening as he watched her laugh at something foolish Mason had done, her whole face lighting up with joy. He was falling for this human woman with her mortal fragility, and her fierce strength and her beautiful son. And it was the worst possible thing that could happen, because Arya still didn't know what he was. She saw him as just a wealthy eccentric with pale features and odd hours. She didn't know about the fangs he kept carefully hidden, the blood he consumed in private, the centuries he'd lived while empires rose and fell. She didn't know that touching him was like touching marble, that his heart beat only a few times per minute, that he was technically a corpse animated by ancient magic and the curse of immortality, and he had no idea how to tell her. The problem came to a head on a cold November evening when Arya arrived at the estate looking troubled. Mason was teething and cranky, and she seemed more frazzled than usual. "Rough day?" Alaric asked as she set up Mason's play area with practiced efficiency. "Rough week," Arya admitted. "My landlord is selling the building. I have 60 days to find a new place, and everything I can afford is either too far from here or in neighborhoods I don't feel safe in with Mason." The protectiveness Alaric felt intensified immediately. "You could move here." The words were out before he could stop them, and Arya froze, turning to stare at him with wide eyes. "What?" "The estate has plenty of room," Alaric continued, committed now. "The east wing has several suites that are currently unused. You and Mason could have your own private space, and you wouldn't need to commute. It would be considerably more convenient." "I can't just move in with my employer," Arya said. But he could hear the temptation in her voice. People would think I'm offering convenient housing to a valued employee," Alaric said, "which is exactly what I'm doing. There's a full kitchen in the east wing, separate entrance, completely private. You'd barely even see me if you didn't want to." That last part was a lie. He'd see her constantly. But he needed her to say yes, needed to know she was safe under his roof where he could protect her. Arya looked torn, her gaze moving between him and Mason, who was gnawing on his fist and whimpering. "The rent I'm paying now is already stretching my budget," she admitted. "I've been trying to save, but it's hard." "Then don't pay rent," Alaric said. "Consider it part of your employment package. Room and board in addition to your salary. That's too generous. You're already paying me so much, Ms. Nichols." He moved closer, and she looked up at him with those hazel eyes that always made his carefully constructed control waver. "Let me help you. You don't have to struggle alone anymore." Something in her expression crumbled, and he saw the raw vulnerability underneath her careful composure. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much?" "Because I'm falling in love with you," Alaric thought. Because you make me feel things I haven't felt in centuries. Because you look at me like I'm a person rather than a monster or a king or a means to an end. But what he said was, because you deserve help, and because I can provide it. That should be reason enough. Arya studied him for a long moment, and he had the unnerving sensation that she saw more than he wanted her to. Finally, she nodded slowly. Okay, yes, thank you. I'll move in. Relief flooded through him, so intense it was almost painful. Good. I'll have Isolde prepare the suite. You can move in whenever you're ready. She moved in the following weekend, and Alaric found himself overseeing the process with far too much personal interest. He made sure her suite was perfect, comfortable furniture. A nursery for fun with everything a baby could need. A modern kitchen stocked with food. He even had the walls painted in soft, warm colors that he thought she might like, drawing on his centuries of accumulated knowledge about human aesthetics when Arya walked into her new home carrying Mason and a single suitcase, which was apparently all she had, her eyes filled with tears. This is too much, she said, her voice breaking. Alaric, this is way too much. It's exactly enough, he corrected gently. You're important to me, Arya. Both of you are. Let me do this. She looked at him then with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and longing and fear. I don't understand you. I don't understand why you're so kind to us. Perhaps I'm simply selfish, Alaric said with a slight smile. I want you happy and comfortable so you continue working for me. But they both knew that was a lie. Living under the same roof changed things between them. It was impossible to maintain professional distance when they shared space. When Alaric would encounter Arya in the gardens with Mason in the mornings before he retreated from the rising sun, when she would find him in the library late at night and sit with him in comfortable silence. They began to talk, really talk. Sharing pieces of themselves they'd kept hidden, Arya told him about her difficult childhood, raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs, about her dreams of college that never materialized when money was tight, about meeting Mason's father and believing he was different from all the other men who disappointed her, only to be proven wrong in the worst possible way. She spoke with a raw honesty that made Alaric's chest ache. This woman who had been through so much and still managed to be kind, to be strong, to love her son with such fierce devotion. In return, Alaric told her carefully edited versions of his own story. He spoke of growing up in Europe, true, though he omitted that it was in the 1520s. He mentioned his family's wealth, true, though he didn't explain it came from centuries of careful investment and the spoils of vampire politics. He talked about feeling different, isolated, never quite fitting in, all true, though the reasons were far more supernatural than he admitted. You seem lonely, Arya said one night when they sat together in the library, Mason asleep in her arms. For someone with so much, you seem very alone. I've been alone for a long time, Alaric admitted, the truth slipping out before he could stop it. It becomes a habit. You don't have to be anymore, Arya said softly. Alone, I mean. You have us now, if you want us. Oh, how he wanted them. The wanting was becoming a physical ache, a need that went beyond bloodthirst into something far more dangerous. He wanted Arya in every way possible, wanted her body. Yes, but also her laughter, her thoughts, her presence. Wanted to wake each evening knowing she was there. Wanted to watch Mason grow up. Wanted things that vampires weren't supposed to want, things that could only end in heartbreak. I want you, he said, then realized how that sounded. I want you both here. You've changed things, made them better. Arya's breath caught, and something electric sparked between them. Mason stirred, breaking the moment, and she looked down at her son with a soft smile. We should get him to bed. It's late. But as she stood to leave, Alaric caught her hand, his cold fingers wrapping around her warm ones. She froze, looking down at their joined hands with wide eyes. You're freezing, she said. Are you feeling okay? Your hands are like ice, poor circulation. Alaric lied smoothly, one of many excuses he'd perfected over the years. I'm fine, but he wasn't fine. He was touching her, feeling the warmth of her human blood just beneath the skin, and it was both torture and ecstasy. He should let go. He should maintain distance. He should remember all the reasons why this was a terrible idea. Instead, he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture from another era that made her shiver. Good night, Arya, he murmured. Good night, she whispered, and fled with Mason in her arms. Leaving Alaric alone in the library with his conflicted thoughts, things shifted after that night. There was a new awareness between them, a tension that hadn't existed before. Arya would blush when he entered a room. Alaric would find excuses to be near her, to brush against her accidentally on purpose, to hold Mason just so he could be close to them both. Isolde watched it all with increasingly obvious amusement, and several times Alaric caught her on the verge of saying something before thinking better of it. The problem was that Alaric's vampire nature was becoming harder to hide. He'd been so careful for so long, but proximity bred familiarity, and familiarity bred questions. Arya began to notice things: how he never ate when she did, how he was never around during the day, how his skin stayed perpetually cold no matter the temperature. She was too intelligent not to realize something was off, even if she couldn't quite identify what. The crisis came on a December evening when everything fell apart in the worst possible way. Arya had put Mason to bed early and come to find Alaric in his study, where he was dealing with correspondence from the Vampire Council. He should have heard her approach, should have hidden the letter written in the old tongue that no modern human could read, but he was distracted by the content reports of a rogue vampire in his territory, one who was feeding recklessly and risking exposure. "What language is that?" Arya asked from the doorway, and Alaric's head snapped up. "It's Old Latin," he said quickly, folding the letter. "Some of my business associates are traditional. It doesn't look like any Latin I've seen." She moved closer, curious rather than suspicious. "What does it say?" "Nothing interesting. Merely border disputes and territory management. All true in its way." Arya tilted her head, studying him with those too perceptive eyes. "You know what's weird? I've been living here for almost 2 months, and I don't think I've ever seen you during the day. Not once." Alaric went very still, every predatory instinct suddenly alert. "I work at night. I thought we'd established that. But never during the day? Not even just waking up or having breakfast." She wasn't accusing, merely puzzled. "And you never eat." "I've never seen you eat anything except maybe sip coffee. And your skin is always so cold, like you're hypothermic, but you never seem bothered by it. I have medical conditions that make you essentially nocturnal with no appetite and hypothermia." Arya interrupted, and now there was something sharper in her voice. "What exactly are these conditions, Alaric?" He could lie. He was good at lying, had perfected it over centuries. But looking at Arya, at this woman he'd come to care for so deeply, the lies stuck in his throat. He didn't want to deceive her anymore. Didn't want this relationship, whatever it was, built on false foundations. "I need to show you something," he said quietly. "But I need you to promise me you'll listen before you react." Alarm flashed across her face. "You're scaring me. I don't mean to. But what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, and I need you to trust that I would never hurt you or Mason. Can you promise me that?" Arya hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay, I promise." Alaric stood, moving to stand before the window where moonlight streamed through the glass. He took a breath, he didn't need another human habit, and turned to face her. "What I'm about to show you will be frightening," he said. "But remember that I'm the same person I've always been. This doesn't change how I feel about you. How you feel about me." Arya's voice was barely a whisper, but Alaric was committed now. He let the careful control he always maintained slip, let his true nature rise to the surface. His eyes shifted from pale gray to vivid crimson, the color of fresh blood. His fangs extended, sharp and lethal, visible even as he kept his mouth closed. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen around him, drawn to him like moths to flame. Arya gasped, stumbling backward. "What the hell?" "I'm a vampire," Alaric said simply. "I have been for over 500 years. Everything else I've told you is true: my name, my history, my feelings, but I'm not human. I haven't been human since 1534. The silence that followed was deafening. Arya stared at him with wide, terrified eyes, her hand pressed to her mouth. Alaric could hear her heart racing, could smell the adrenaline flooding her system, and hated himself for causing her fear. "This is insane," she finally said. "This is actually insane. Vampires aren't real. Yes, we are." Alaric stayed very still, making himself as non-threatening as possible. "We've always been real. We simply hide very well." "Oh my God. Oh my God." Arya was breathing too fast, on the edge of panic. "You're going to kill me. You're going to kill me and Mason. That's why you brought us here. You were playing with your food or something." "No!" The word came out sharper than he intended, and she flinched. Alaric softened his voice immediately. "No, Arya. I brought you here because I wanted to help you. Because I care about you. That's the truth. How can I believe anything you say?" She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "You've been lying to me this whole time." "I lied about what I am," Alaric admitted, "but nothing else was a lie. My feelings for you are real. My desire to protect you and Mason is real. The person you've come to know, that's who I am, regardless of what I am. You drink blood. You're a vampire. You drink people's blood. Yes. No point in denying it. But I don't kill. I haven't killed for feeding in over a century. There are ethical sources available now, donated blood from hospitals, willing donors. I would never hurt an innocent person." Arya was shaking her head, backing toward the door. "I need to leave. I need to take Mason and go, please don't. Alaric moved without thinking, using his speed to place himself between her and the exit. She screamed, and he immediately stepped back, hating himself. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I won't stop you. But please, just listen for a moment. Why should I? Because you know me, Arya. You've spent months getting to know me. Has anything I've done suggested I would hurt you? She stared at him, chest heaving, and he could see her mind working through it. Finally, she shook her head slowly. No, but that doesn't mean I love you, Alaric said, the words tumbling out desperately. I love you and Mason. That's why I've been so involved, why I can't seem to maintain proper distance. I'm 500 years old, and I've never felt this way about anyone. You make me want things I gave up on centuries ago. You make me feel human again. Arya's breath hitched. Don't say things like that when I don't know if I can trust you. You can trust me. He let his vampire features recede, returning to his normal appearance. I swear to you on everything I am, you and Mason are safe here. I would destroy anyone who tried to harm either of you. You're under my protection, and in my world, that's an unbreakable bond. Your world, Arya repeated. The vampire world, yes. Is it just you, or are there others? Many others. We have entire societies, rules, territories. He hesitated. Then decided she deserved the full truth. I'm a king. I rule the eastern vampire territories, which includes this entire region. Arya laughed, but it was an edge of hysteria sound. Of course you are. Of course I accidentally became the employee of a vampire king. Why not? That's just my luck. Arya, I need time, she said abruptly. I need time to think about this, to process. I won't leave tonight because it's late and Mason is asleep, but I need you to stay away from us. Can you do that? It physically hurt to agree, but Alaric nodded. Of course, whatever you need. She fled then, rushing back to her suite in the east wing, and Alaric heard the sound of her locking the door. He stood alone in his study, feeling more helpless than he had in centuries. He'd finally told her the truth, and it might have cost him everything. The next few days were torture. Arya stayed in her suite, only emerging to get food from the kitchen when she clearly thought Alaric wasn't around. She avoided the main house entirely, and the one time he tried to approach her, she'd actually flinched away from him. That had been worse than any physical wound. Mason's laughter, which had become such a constant joy in the house, was noticeably absent. Alaric found himself listening for it obsessively, craving proof that they were okay even if they wanted nothing to do with him. Isolde found him in the library on the third night, staring at nothing. You told her, the housekeeper said. It wasn't a question. Yes! And she's frightened, terrified. She'll come around, Isolde said gently. Give her time. Learning about our existence is traumatic for humans. What if she doesn't? Alaric looked at his old friend. What if I've lost her forever? Then you let her go, Isolde said. If you truly love her, you let her make her own choice, even if that choice breaks your heart. On the fourth night, Alaric heard a knock on his study door. He opened it to find Arya standing there with Mason on her hip, her expression wary but no longer terrified. Can we talk? She asked. Of course. Always. He stepped back, letting her enter. She sat on one of the leather sofas, settling Mason beside her with some toys. The baby immediately grabbed one and began chewing on it, seemingly unbothered by the tension in the room. I've been doing research, Arya said without preamble. About vampires. There's more information out there than I expected, if you know where to look. Conspiracy theories, folklore, but also some things that seemed more real, more specific. Alaric sat across from her, maintaining a careful distance. What did you find? That vampires are supposed to be dangerous, predatory, that they see humans as food sources and nothing more. She met his eyes. But that doesn't match what I've experienced with you. You've been nothing but kind and protective. So either you're a really good actor, or the folklore is wrong about some things. The folklore is partially wrong, Alaric said carefully. We are predatory by nature. We do need blood to survive. But we're not mindless monsters. We think, feel, love just as humans do. We simply live longer and have different needs. You said you don't kill for feeding anymore. Not in over 100 years. I get donated blood from a medical supply company I own. It's not as satisfying as fresh blood, but it's ethical, and that matters to me. Arya processed this, her fingers absently stroking Mason's head. You really are a king? I am. I've ruled these territories for nearly 2 centuries. Before that, I was a noble in Europe, then adapted to the New World when it became clear that's where power was shifting. Do you have subjects? Other vampires you command? Many. Most stay out of human notice, living quiet lives and feeding discreetly. Occasionally someone breaks our laws, feeds recklessly, kills, risks exposure, and I deal with them. Deal with them how? Punishment. Exile. Execution if necessary. He watched her carefully. We have justice systems, Arya. We're not anarchists. She was quiet for a long moment, and Alaric found himself holding his breath unnecessarily. Finally, she said, "You told me you loved me. I do. How does that work?" "How can a vampire love a human?" "The same way any two beings love each other," Alaric said. "I'm not human anymore, but I remember being human. I remember what it felt like to want connection, companionship, love. Those needs don't disappear just because your heart stops beating." "Your heart doesn't beat?" "Rarely. A few times per minute, just enough to move blood through my system. I don't need to breathe either, though I do out of habit." Arya shuddered slightly. "That's disturbing. I know. I'm sorry. Why me?" she asked suddenly. "You're ancient and powerful and apparently royalty. You could have anyone. Why would you want a struggling single mom with a baby?" "Because you're strong," Alaric said simply. "Because you're kind despite everything you've been through. Because you love your son with a fierceness that takes my breath away. Because when you smile, it's like sunrise, and I haven't been able to see sunrise in 500 years. Tears welled in Arya's eyes. "That's not fair. You can't say things like that. Why not?" "Because it makes me want to believe you, want to trust you, and I'm terrified that's a mistake." Alaric leaned forward, aching to touch her but restraining himself. "I know I'm a monster, Arya. I know what I am. But I'm a monster who would burn down the world to keep you and Mason safe. That has to count for something." "You're not a monster," Arya said, and his head snapped up in shock. "I've seen you with Mason. I've watched you be gentle with him, patient, caring." "Monsters don't do that, Arya." "I'm still scared," she interrupted. "I'm still trying to reconcile the person I thought you were with what you actually are. But I don't think you're a monster. I think you're something else. Something I don't have words for yet. Hope?" Fragile and painful bloomed in Alaric's chest. "Does that mean you'll stay?" "For now," Arya said carefully, "but I need honesty from here on out. No more secrets. If there's anything else I should know about the vampire world, about your life, you need to tell me." "Agreed. Complete honesty. And I need to meet others. Other vampires. I need to understand what your world is really like." That request made Alaric pause. Introducing Arya to vampire society was dangerous. It would mark her as important to him, would make her a target for his enemies. But she deserved to make an informed choice, and that meant seeing the full picture. "All right," he said. "I'll arrange it." Over the following weeks, Alaric slowly introduced Arya to his world. First was Isolde, who revealed her true nature and answered Arya's endless questions with patience and humor. Then came some of the vampires from his court, his second in command, Lucian, his treasurer, Ravenna, his head of security, Thorn, all of them ancient, all of them powerful, all of them studying Arya with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. "She's the reason you've been distracted lately," Lucian observed one evening after Arya had retired. He was a dark-haired vampire with Mediterranean features and a sardonic sense of humor. "The little human with the baby. Her name is Arya," Alaric said sharply. "And yes." "You're taking this seriously." Lucian's expression shifted to concern. "Alaric, I've known you for 3 centuries. I've never seen you involved with a human like this. You know how it ends, don't you? She'll age, she'll die, and you'll be left with the pain. I know the risks. And the child? You're attached to him too. I can see it. Mason is innocent and wonderful. How could I not be attached? Because he's human. Because he'll grow up and leave and die, just like his mother. You're setting yourself up for heartbreak." "Perhaps heartbreak is worth it," Alaric said quietly. "Perhaps loving them for whatever time we have is better than the emptiness I've lived with for so long." Lucian studied him, then shook his head. "You've changed. She's changed you." "Yes," Alaric agreed. "She has." The real test came when Alaric took Arya to a gathering of the vampire court, a formal affair where the city's undead elite came together to discuss territory, business, and politics. Arya wore a dress Alaric had given her, a deep emerald silk that made her eyes seem more gold than hazel, and she looked absolutely breathtaking. But she also looked terrified. "I don't belong here," she whispered as they approached the grand ballroom of the underground complex where court was held. "These are all ancient vampires, and I'm just—" "You're with me," Alaric said firmly, tucking her hand into his elbow. "That makes you exactly where you belong." The gathering was held in a space that looked like it had been transplanted from a medieval castle, all stone walls and Gothic arches and candelabras. Dozens of vampires milled about, all of them beautiful in that uncanny way vampires were, all of them turning to stare as Alaric entered with a human on his arm. The whispers started immediately. "Who is she? Is that a mortal? What is she doing here? What is the king thinking?" Alaric ignored them all, guiding Arya through the crowd with a possessive hand at the small of her back. He introduced her to various members of his court, watching with pride as she handled herself with grace despite her obvious nerves. She asked intelligent questions, showed genuine interest, and slowly began to relax as it became clear that most of the vampires were simply curious rather than hostile. The problem came from an unexpected source. "So this is the human who's captured our king's attention," a cold voice said, and Alaric tensed immediately. Selene Thorne approached them with predatory grace, her alabaster skin and silver hair marking her as one of the oldest vampires present. She was beautiful in the way a poisonous flower was beautiful, striking, and dangerous in equal measure. "Lady Selene," Alaric said neutrally. "May I present Arya Nichols? Charmed," Selene purred, her crimson eyes fixed on Arya. "Tell me, little human, what exactly do you offer our king? Surely it's not intellectual companionship. You can't have even a fraction of his experience or knowledge." "Selene," Alaric warned, his voice dropping dangerously. But Arya stepped forward, meeting the ancient vampire's gaze without flinching. "I offer honesty, compassion, and apparently something he's been missing for a very long time, or he wouldn't have invited me here." The room went silent. Several vampires looked shocked that a human would speak so boldly to one of their elders. Selene herself seemed taken aback for a moment before a slow smile spread across her face. "How delightfully bold," she said. "Perhaps there's more to you than I thought. Very well. Little human, you've earned a modicum of respect." She turned to Alaric. "Be careful with this one, my king. Humans are fragile, and the enemies you've made over the centuries won't hesitate to exploit a weakness." She glided away, leaving Alaric tense and Arya slightly pale. "Did I just make things worse?" Arya asked quietly. "No," Alaric said, surprised to realize he was smiling. "You were perfect, but Selene wasn't wrong about one thing. You being important to me does make you a potential target. Then we'll deal with it together." Arya said firmly, "I'm not running away from this, Alaric. From us. Not anymore." The words sent warmth flooding through him, that simple acknowledgement that they were something together. He wanted to kiss her right there in front of his entire court, wanted to claim her publicly and definitively. But that would have to wait. There were protocols to follow, political considerations to manage. Instead, he simply took her hand and held it for the rest of the evening, and every vampire in attendance understood exactly what that meant. Their relationship deepened after that night. Arya was no longer afraid of what Alaric was, and he no longer had to hide. He showed her the full scope of his abilities, his speed, his strength, his power over shadows. He explained vampire politics, the delicate balance of territories, the ancient laws that govern their society. She absorbed it all with that quick intelligence he so admired, asking questions that sometimes challenged assumptions he'd held for centuries. And slowly, carefully, they began to explore the attraction that had been building between them from the beginning. It started with small touches, Alaric brushing a strand of hair from her face, Arya resting her hand on his arm. Then longer moments sitting close enough that their bodies pressed together, his arm around her shoulders, her head against his chest where his heart barely beat. The first time he kissed her, it was late at night in the library. Mason was asleep upstairs, and they'd been talking about poetry, of all things. Arya had been laughing at one of Alaric's stories about meeting Byron in Venice, and the sound of her joy had been too much. He'd leaned in without thinking, capturing her lips with his. She'd frozen for just a moment, and he'd started to pull back, worried he'd overstepped. But then she'd melted into him, her warm hands coming up to frame his cold face, and kissed him back with a passion that ignited something primal in his chest. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, though only one of them actually needed to, Alaric pressed his forehead to hers. "Tell me this is real," he whispered. "Tell me I'm not imagining this. It's real," Arya assured him. "It's terrifying and complicated and probably crazy, but it's real." They took things slowly after that, mindful of Mason and the complicated dynamics of their situation. But the love between them grew undeniable, expressed in lingering glances and soft touches, and the way Alaric would hold both Arya and Mason together, feeling more complete than he had in 5 centuries. The danger Selene had warned about manifested 3 months later. Alaric was in a council meeting in the underground complex when Isolde burst in, her composure shattered in a way he'd never seen. "The estate has been breached," she gasped. "Rogues! They're after the human and her child." Alaric was moving before she finished speaking, using his full speed to race back to the mansion faster than any car could travel. Terror gripped him, cold and absolute. If anything happened to Arya and Mason, if his enemies managed to hurt them because of their connection to him. He reached the estate to find chaos. Several vampires rogues, by their feral appearance and lack of coordination, had broken through the wards and were trying to force their way into the East Wing. His security team was engaging them, but there were too many, and they were fighting with the desperation of vampires who had nothing to lose. Alaric didn't hesitate. He tore through the rogues with centuries of combat experience and rage fueling his movements. He was the vampire king, ancient and powerful beyond measure, and these fools had dared to threaten what was his. The battle was brief and brutal. When it was over, the rogues lay destroyed, nothing but ash and scattered remains. Alaric's security team stood around him, battered but victorious, and through it all, he'd heard no sounds from the east wing, which meant either Arya had stayed silent and safe, or he couldn't finish that thought. He raced to her suite and found the door locked from the inside, exactly as protocol dictated. "Arya," he called. "It's me. It's safe now." There was a long pause, then the sound of furniture being moved. She'd barricaded the door. When it finally opened, Arya stood there pale but defiant, holding Mason protectively and clutching a knife that Alaric had given her weeks ago, just in case. "Are they gone?" she asked. "Yes, they're all gone. You're safe." He wanted to pull her into his arms but held back, aware he was covered in blood and ash. "I'm so sorry. This is exactly what I was afraid of. It's not your fault." Arya set down the knife and crossed to him, seemingly unbothered by his state. She wrapped her free arm around him while clutching Mason with the other, and Alaric folded them both into his embrace. "We knew there were risks. I should have protected you better. Should have had more security. You got here in time. We're okay." She pulled back to look at him, and he saw not fear in her eyes, but determination. "This is part of your world. I accept that. You could have died tonight." "Mason could have died, but we didn't." Arya's voice was firm. "And I'm not leaving you, Alaric. If that's what you're about to suggest, save your breath." "I can't lose you," he said, his voice breaking. "Either of you. You've become everything to me. Then we'll figure out how to stay safe. Together." She kissed him gently, and Mason made a sleepy sound between them, apparently unaware of the drama. No matter what. After that night, Alaric increased security tenfold and launched a campaign to root out any remaining threats to his territory. The message went out clearly: the human and her child were under his direct protection, and anyone who touched them would face his full wrath. Most of the vampire community got the message quickly. Those who didn't learn the hard way that a vampire king's vengeance was thorough and absolute. Through it all, Arya remained steadfast. She'd seen the worst of vampire society and chose to stay anyway. She loved him anyway. It was humbling and terrifying, and more than he deserved. 6 months after Arya had learned the truth, Alaric found himself on one knee in the same library where he'd first kissed her. Mason toddled nearby, having recently learned to walk, babbling happily to himself. Arya stared at Alaric with wide eyes, one hand pressed to her mouth. "I know this is complicated," Alaric said, holding out a ring that had belonged to his mother 5 centuries ago, a ruby set in ancient gold. "I know I'm not human, and I can't grow old with you in the traditional sense, but I love you with everything I am. I want to spend whatever time we have together as husband and wife. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Arya said without hesitation, tears streaming down her face. "Yes. Of course, yes." He slipped the ring on her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms and kissing her deeply. Mason chose that moment to crash into their legs, demanding attention, and they broke apart laughing. Alaric scooped up the toddler, who immediately grabbed at his white hair with sticky fingers and wrapped his other arm around Arya. "You're sure about this?" he asked her quietly. "About all of it? The vampire world? The danger? The complications?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Arya said, looking at him with those remarkable hazel eyes full of love. "You're mine, Alaric Nyx, and I'm yours, for whatever time we have." They married in a ceremony that blended human and vampire traditions, attended by Arya's small human family and Alaric's extensive vampire court. It was beautiful and strange and perfect, just like their relationship. Mason served as ring bearer with significant help and stole the show by loudly declaring, "Dada!" When Alaric picked him up afterward, the word made Alaric freeze. He looked at Arya, who had tears in her eyes. "I didn't teach him that," she said softly. "He figured it out on his own, Dada!" Mason repeated, patting Alaric's face with those chubby hands. "Dada, Dada!" Something in Alaric's chest cracked open completely. This child wasn't his by blood, but he was his in every way that mattered. His son, his family, his heart. "Yes," Alaric whispered, holding Mason close. "Yes, I'm your Dada." They settled into married life with surprising ease. Arya continued to help with Alaric's administrative work, though now as his wife and partner rather than just an employee. Mason grew like a weed, hitting toddler milestones and charming every vampire who crossed his path with his sunny personality. Alaric's court adjusted to having a human queen and her mortal child in their midst, and those who couldn't adjust found themselves relocated to other territories. The years passed. Mason started school, Arya became involved in vampire-human relations, working to build bridges between the two worlds in ways that benefited everyone. Alaric ruled his territories with Arya at his side, and found that her modern perspective and human empathy made him a better leader. But always, in the back of Alaric's mind, was the awareness of time passing. Arya was aging slowly, gracefully, but aging nonetheless. He remained unchanged, eternally frozen at 30. Mason grew from toddler to child to teenager, and Alaric loved him fiercely through every phase, teaching him and protecting him, and being the father the boy deserved. The question of turning Arya into a vampire came up occasionally. She could become immortal like him, could stop aging, could stay by his side forever, but every time they discussed it, she hesitated. "I want to see Mason grow up," she said when he was 12. "I want to be human for that. After, maybe after. Can you wait?" "I would wait an eternity for you," Alaric promised, and he meant it. When Mason turned 18 and left for college, Arya was 43. She still looked beautiful to Alaric, the lines at her eyes and the silver threading through her hair only making her more lovely in his opinion. But he could see her mortality more clearly now, could sense the gradual slowing of her system, the way humans age toward their eventual end. "I'm ready," Arya said one evening as they sat together in the library, the same place where so much of their relationship had unfolded. "I'm ready to become like you, if you'll still have me. Still have you?" Alaric pulled her close, breathing in her scent, feeling her warm blood just beneath the surface. "Arya, I will always want you, in any form. Are you certain? There's no going back once it's done." "I'm certain." She cupped his face, looking at him with absolute trust. "We've had a beautiful mortal life together. Now I want an immortal one. I want forever with you, Alaric." The turning was done carefully, with Arya under medical supervision from the best vampire doctors his money could buy. It was painful, there was no way around that, but she bore it with the same strength she'd shown through everything else. Alaric stayed with her through every moment, holding her hand, whispering reassurances, being there as she died as a human and was reborn as a vampire. When she opened her eyes 3 days later, they were the vivid crimson of a newly turned vampire. She gasped, taking in her first unnecessary breath, and looked at her hands in wonder. "Everything is so clear," she whispered. "So vivid. I can hear everything, smell everything. Is this what you experience all the time?" "Welcome to immortality, my love," Alaric said, kissing her forehead. "How do you feel?" "Powerful. Strange. Hungry." She looked at him with new eyes that held ancient instincts. "And I really need to feed." He helped her through those difficult first weeks, teaching her control, helping her adapt to her new senses and abilities. It was like falling in love all over again, discovering this new version of Arya, who retained everything he loved about her, but now had centuries ahead of her to explore it all. Mason came home for winter break to find his mother transformed. He'd known it was coming, they'd discussed it extensively, but seeing her with her new vampire features was still jarring. She still looked like his mom, but now with pale skin and eyes that shifted between hazel and crimson depending on her hunger. "Mom," he said tentatively. "It's still me," Arya promised, not approaching too quickly. New vampires could be dangerous, even to those they loved. Just me in a different form. Mason studied her for a long moment, then broke into a grin. "You're going to be insufferable now that you have super speed. You'll never not win an argument." They laughed together, and the awkwardness dissolved. Mason had grown up in the vampire world. It was normal to him. Having his mom become one simply meant she'd be around longer, and he was grateful for that. Years continued to pass, but now Alaric and Arya moved through them together unchanged. Mason grew into a remarkable young man, studied medicine, met a lovely young woman, and eventually married. He gave them children who called Alaric Grandpa, and played in the gardens where he'd once caught a falling infant over 2 decades earlier. Through it all, Alaric and Arya ruled the Eastern Territories together, building a vampire society that balanced old traditions with new ethics. They made their world better, safer, more just, and in their private moments, they were simply 2 people who loved each other completely, who had found each other through impossibility, and chosen to stay together through everything. On the 25th anniversary of the night they'd met, when Arya had fainted on those library steps, and Alaric had caught her falling baby, they returned to that spot. The library was long since closed, the building locked, but such things were no barrier to vampires. They stood at the top of the marble steps where it had all begun, and Alaric pulled Arya into his arms. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Any of it? The complications? The danger, giving up your mortal life?" "Never," Arya said firmly. "You saved Mason that night. But really, you saved both of us. You gave us safety and love and a future I never could have imagined. How could I regret the best thing that ever happened to me?" I was the one who was saved, Alaric corrected. I was so lonely before you, so empty. You brought light back into my darkness. Then we saved each other, Arya said, pulling him down for a kiss. And we'll keep saving each other every day for the rest of eternity. For the rest of eternity, Alaric agreed, and kissed his wife beneath the moonlight, in the spot where a single moment of chance had changed everything. They had forever now. All the time in the world to love each other, to watch their family grow, to build something beautiful together. It wasn't a traditional happy ending, it was something better. It was a beginning that never had to end, a love that transcended the boundaries between human and vampire, mortal and immortal. And somewhere in the mansion they called home, their grandson played with toys in a room that had once been set up for his infant father. Proof that some love stories didn't just last forever, they created ripples that echoed through generations, touching lives in ways that could never be predicted or measured. Alaric had lived for 5 centuries before that fateful evening. He would live for countless more. But those moments, catching a falling baby, meeting a desperate young mother, choosing to help rather than look away, those moments had defined everything that came after. They had led him to love, to family, to a life that felt full rather than empty. He had been a king for so long, powerful and commanding and alone, but Arya had taught him something his centuries of experience couldn't, that sometimes the most valuable thing you could do was simply catch someone when they fell. And in catching others, you might just save yourself. They stood together on those library steps, 2 vampires who had once been something entirely different, and looked up at the stars that would outlast even their immortal lives. They had each other. They had their family. They had forever. And really, what more could anyone ask for?